Hello, I'm Amita Baig. I'm the Executive Director of World Monuments Fund in India, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today to Constructing Conservation Narratives, the Patel Stadium and Other Modern Buildings by Rahul Mehrotra. This event is part of an On My Watch series hosted by WMF, which explores the political, cultural, technical, conservation issues surrounding the preservation of cultural heritage at risk, sites on the World Monuments Watch. Today, we look at the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Stadium in Ahmedabad, India. The stadium was included on the 2020 World Monuments Watch, a nomination-based program that advocates for heritage at risk around the globe. This site was selected to draw attention to the complex challenges of preserving not only an iconic 20th century modern structure, but an emblematic public space for the people of Ahmedabad. The stadium, located in the heart of the city, represents the progressive ideals and the experimental spirit that characterized India's post-independence period. Designed in the 60s by the renowned architect Charles Correa and engineer Mahendra Raj, the stadium is part of a larger constellation of structures built in Ahmedabad by a generation of national and international architects who helped create a new architectural heritage vocabulary in India. This stadium was originally built to host international cricket matches, including the first ever one-day international cricket match in 1981. The stadium is open to the public and has become an important hub for the local community, who use it for recreation and as an event space for local schools. It has become a unique resource for quality open space in a country where urban encroachment is increasing every day. WMF is embarking on a conservation management plan for Patel Stadium, made possible with support from the Getty Foundation through its Keeping It Modern grant. And a management plan will ensure a clear roadmap for the future restoration and reuse of the stadium, conserving its assets while ensuring it is repurposed for future generations. Ahmedabad is especially noteworthy for the significant number of modern buildings, and their stewardship is made even more meaningful with the partnership of the Municipal Commissioner, Mr. Mukesh Kumar, IAS. As the Commissioner of Ahmedabad, his focus is on creating a city for people, and he spearheads essential infrastructure schemes such as riverfront development and rehabilitation of houses. However, it is his role in the listing of Ahmedabad as India's first World Heritage City, which is particularly noteworthy.
Greetings from the World Heritage City of Ahmedabad, India. It gives me great pleasure to talk to you about the Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel Stadium. The iconic structure is situated in the center of the city, close to the junction of Metro Line and the first major arterial road outside the walled city of Ahmedabad. The several landmark buildings like Kocharav Ashram, AMGA Library, BM Institute, Ahmedabad Textile Mill Association Building, Gujarat Vidyapeeth, and Sabarmati Ashram is on this road. The story begins in early 1950s when the province of Bombay gave about 80,000 square yard land to Ahmedabad Cricket Club. The cricket club delegated the project and land to Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation at a nominal cost. Since then, AMC has been actively engaged as the primary owner of the stadium right since its inception, including construction and overall operation and maintenance of the stadium. This architectural icon has many famous cricket events associated with it. The first one-day international was played in 1981. There is also home ground of Gujarat cricket team that plays Ranji Trophy. Numerous cricketing events such as legends as Sunil Gavaskar, Dilip Vengsarkar, Kirti Ajad, Madan Lal, and Ravi Sastry, who is currently the coach of Indian team, have played on this stadium. Among the current players, presently the Parthiv Patel, Jasprit Bumrah has also played on this ground. The stadium has open access to various cross-section of the people who enjoy the quality open space. On a bright early morning, one can see the place filled with sparring young adults attending cricket coaching camps, sitting, walking, and jogging around the running tracks, and numerous fitness enthusiasts using the stand to perform various exercises. AMC is the proud owner of such a magnificent structure, and it is excited to embark the journey with World Monument Fund with a dream to ensure that the people of Ahmedabad and future generations can continue to use this masterpiece of modern architecture, which has a structural form of beauty blended in remains useful for the future generations. Thank you very much.
That augurs so well going forward. Our keynote speaker today, I'm delighted to introduce my very dear friend Rahul Mehrotra, who probably needs no introduction to the many people who are watching this program today. As founder and principal of RMA Architects, he divides his time between Mumbai and Harvard University, where he is the professor of urban design and the John T. Dunlop Professor in Housing and Urbanization. His most recent book, Working in Mumbai, is a compilation of an extraordinarily diverse body of work. Rahul, thank you so much. It is a real privilege to have you with us today. And before I hand you over to Rahul, I'd like to tell you that this event is hosted in partnership with the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects and has been approved for AIA HSW credits. To receive credits for this webinar, follow the instructions at the link that will be posted in the chat later in the program. So do follow that. Rahul, over to you.
Thank you, Amita. Thank you. Let me just share my screen and then we can get going. Good day, everyone. There we go. All good? You can see the screen clear? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Amita. Thank you to the World Monuments Fund for this invitation to sort of share my thoughts, I'd say. I think this is really exciting. First of all, I want to kind of, say that it's amazing that the World Monuments Fund chose this stadium. And I think for many reasons, I think the Municipal Commissioner's words were very inspiring in some ways. And I believe that to select a project like this, which of course has great significance architecturally and from the point of view of engineering and technology, but also because it's such a public project, a project which the city owns, which the municipality owns, it can't actually get more public than this in some ways. And if we have to really situate a debate about our modern architecture as heritage and its conservation, I mean, to take it head on like this, I think is very exciting. It's very relevant. And again, I just sort of want to congratulate you all for having selected this. This, as has already been said, has been designed by Charles Correa and Mahendra Raj, a true partnership. For me personally, this has been a great opportunity to dwell into the Charles Correa Foundation archives, which are a wonderful repository of Charles Correa's work, an archive he put together actually before he passed away. So it's curated to the extent that I think it surfaces aspects about these projects or his vast repertoire of work in very, very interesting ways. And, from the archives, one has culled many things, which I'd like to just sort of share to warm us up to the broader and more complicated issues. And one of them was, of course, and this is, of course, through the grapevine, through Rohit Raj, talking to Mahendra Raj, Monica Correa, many other people who recollect this, that, this was truly a collaboration between Mahendra Raj and Charles Correa. Besides the fact they were close collaborators and friends, I think this was a project where Charles Correa, as the architect, recognized that technology was going to drive many decisions. And from what I at least hear, and this is oral history, which sometimes has its own distortions, Charles Correa said, in this case, we're just going to split the fees even down the line because we are going to be equal partners in all aspects. And therefore, I think it's symbolic of a partnership in some ways. I mean, it's a kind of pragmatic aspect, but really symbolic. This was also a project that took many years to build. It's a very elegant scheme. It was built from 59 to 66, built meaning designed in 59 and actually finished in 66. 2 or 3 years into the design, Charles Correa was offered a very kind of prestigious chair at MIT in Boston, the Bemis Professorship, which he, was very rare and he took. And so for 6 months, the process was interrupted, but not really, because his close friend, who had also been his classmate at MIT as a student, had shared an apartment with him, Fred Taylor, who's now in his 90s. I believe he's also listening to this talk. lives in the US, came from America to India, lived in Ahmedabad and based in Bombay and Ahmedabad, actually shared an apartment for a while with Mahendra Raj. And kept the project going. And it was Fred Taylor who was around when the foundation stone was laid, I think in 62 or close to 63. I'm not really sure about the dates, but it was a foundation stone that was laid by C.K. Naidu, which is also a very important part of history in terms of the cricketing history in the country. And so there is a rich history of the role this stadium has played in the life of Ahmedabad, which is, I think, very, very important. It was a stadium designed for 35,000 people, very ambitious in terms of scale. And it was designed, I think, which is also for me very interesting, which is what makes this diagram incredibly interesting and elegant, is that it was truly a sports complex. It had a component of a club, which you see on the right. It had the stadium. It had a jogging track. It had a skating rink, which is what you see at the bottom left of the slide as the pure circle, tennis courts, etc. And that skating rink, of course, didn't get built. But when I was going through the archives, it really struck me as a very beautiful piece, almost Zen-like in its articulation, a circle, and you can see how the ramp peels off the circle to create access. Very minimal and incredibly elegant, even in section, how it sits into the ground. And I hope something like this gets built, because all the drawings for it exists, and it would truly complete really this ensemble for sports in Ahmedabad. But also the stadium itself, a really robust structure. I mean, credit to Mahendra Raj and Charles Correa for integrating really technology and architecture. And I just want you to kind of note the way the services, in this case, the changing rooms and the toilets, are tucked below the structure, but free of the arcade and in plan. And so that is the arcade, and this is actually very important to note for reuse, for expanding other uses, because integral to the structure is a space which allows this extension of use in ways of reinventing its purpose as time goes on when other things are required. And of course, the archives has a wonderful collection of drawings, and you realize the kind of depth and attention to detail that was paid, how the concrete was folded in such interesting ways to incorporate railings for safety, to incorporate pedestals for seats, and even the seats themselves. And this integration between the architectural moves and the structural contingencies makes it a really brilliant piece of work. And study models here, you kind of almost see a crudeness in this handmade model, which was the way, because there was no parametrics and computer and computation, that between the calculations that Mahendra Raj must have done in writing and its translation into form to not only imagine the aesthetic beauty of it, but also its structural integrity, was models like this. And truly a handmade structure, which was also characteristic of the time, concrete, which was made in a very labor-intensive way, which was, again, the moment at that particular time. And of course, the elegance, I can't but keep stating this, is just absolutely wonderful when one looks at these original drawings in the archives, even in the way the clubhouse creates a sort of promenade for members, at least, to enter the building. It has different entrances for other parts of the city, other populations, and all kind of quite well integrated into the landscape. But also, like any project, it had many components, and here's the badminton hall. Again, you see such innovation in these sections in terms of how Mahendra Raj has resolved height, space, using the same vocabulary of the folded plates. So there's a consistency across even building types that exist within the campus. And I think that is quite wonderful. And it shows this sort of integration between technology and architectonics, really, right through the whole complex. But then, of course, like any project that involved many constituencies, which is the publicness of it, and we'll come to this question, it went through many iterations. You see the skating rink has moved to the top, tennis courts have moved, the clubhouse requirements are beginning to change. Then as time goes on, it even changes more. The entrance changes, it flips back. And there are many, many iterations, and this project over the 7 or 8 years finally landed in somewhat like this plan shows. And that's what we sort of finally achieved here, or was achieved by the city here, was a part of the stadium that was covered. It wasn't completed, although the structure was completed. And then you have a fragmentation of programs around the site. But as the municipal commissioner explained, this is a very robust site in the city in terms of its access points, in terms of the infrastructure around it, roads, the metro, and really is an incredible asset for the city, and has a great future. So let's sort of kind of think about placing it in a broader context, because it's a complex problem that the city has to deal with, the World Monument Fund is thinking through. And I just want to kind of put many thoughts on the table so that it might help us understand it better. Excuse me if you're confused at the end of this, but they say in today's complex world, if you're confused, it just means you're thinking clearly. So let's move to Correa in Ahmedabad, because I think this is the first step in that narrative, because the significance of this building also is situated within the projects that he was doing, because he did many infrastructure related projects. And this is a very important point because, I mean, when we talk about publicness, private houses, even private campuses are private. And so therefore the narratives you have to build to protect them are quite different from projects that are public, because they belong to a much broader constituency. And this is a very critical point. And I think what Correa did in Ahmedabad is very interesting, because in the early part, he did the Gandhi Ashram, which is a significant building, also very public. It's the world's heritage in a sense, and it's a beautiful ashram. He also did some seminal houses. But I think compared to many architects who were working then, he also did a lot of infrastructure buildings, not only institutions, but the stadium. He also did bus terminals. He did infrastructure for the repair for the transportation company. So these are the 12 odd projects that he did. This is Gun House, all built around that same period of 10 years, which is for the Rifle Association, but it also to create a kind of internal cross subsidy, also articulated spatially programs where space could be rent out to support this institution, built in the same kind of technology. He also explored possibilities in trying to connect traditional ways people occupied otlas with covers to create bus stops and bus terminals in a sense. What you also see is a bus repair depot where you see again the folded plate with Mahendra Raj being articulated in this case to bring in skylights. The Navrangpura bus stop, which was never completed, the upper floor was never completed, but it's a very elegant piece where the building itself serves as a cover for people to occupy space below it, waiting for the bus with offices above. And so then you kind of expand this lens and you look at modern buildings in Ahmedabad and India. And that is also quite an amazing narrative, because Ahmedabad sort of offered the kind of patronage that modern architecture had perhaps not experienced before in any one place, in a sense. The families who owned the cotton mills of Ahmedabad, particularly the Sarabhai family, the Lalbhai family, were more representative of the new India than actually even the constituency for whom Nehru was building in Chandigarh. These families saw the necessity of combining modernity and tradition to compete in world markets, really a true kind of global thinking of the time. Essentially, they facilitated a context of patronage, so to speak, in which modernism could interact in the truest sense with the culture that it was now set in. And through the Ahmedabad experiment, modernism finally put its roots down in India, with an entire generation of architects inspired and committed for all that modernism really stood for here, in this case, as an architectural style. And if I look at 20th century architecture in Ahmedabad, of course, this is going up to the 90s. It's an amazing collection of 35 odd buildings, all the way from the early 1950s, or sorry, the mid 1950s to later. Claude Batley was a little earlier, but that was pre-independence. But it's an amazing array of buildings crossing both residential as well as institutional. And this was a very euphoric moment for architecture in India. If I break it down and look at, the first generation of Indian architects, which you see in blue, again, it's a substantial collection of buildings which are worthy of attention as an ensemble, because that narrative, I think, helps us situate perhaps the most public of these buildings, which is the stadium. And that's why I was commending World Monuments Fund for selecting this, because it kind of takes the questions to one end of the spectrum of publicness. And I think if one can resolve these issues of what significance means and what it means to develop a constituency to conserve these buildings in a kind of extreme condition of publicness, I think it'll bear us well for the other broader discussion. And so this euphoric phase was very important. And here I've just sort of distilled in green what you see are the buildings by the masters, which is really Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, who kind of set the kind of pace in a sense. And of course, Corbusier's progressive social ideals and architectural ideals fitted neatly with Nehru's ambition in that sense for India. And of course, this is where the experiment started, which was Chandigarh. But what we kind of developed in India was what one could call a spine of modernism or architectural awareness, which ran from Chandigarh all the way with Antonian Raymond in Pondicherry, which is sort of an aberration. It happens simultaneously early without this influence, but you have to recognize it. But this was really where a lot of fantastic modern architecture was developed. And of course, Corbusier and Louis Kahn, here the IIM by Louis Kahn and the Mill Owners Association by Corbusier. Corbusier did many houses too, but this was a public building together with the Sanskar Kendra, which is the Municipal Corporation's museum. And there was a Frank Lloyd Wright building, which is the drawing here, which never got built. It was the headquarters for the Calico Mills that the Sarabhais had commissioned, but for various reasons, it didn't get built. But imagine if even Frank Lloyd Wright had arrived in Ahmedabad, it would have been really a grand slam for the city as you speak. So then you had the first generation of Indian architects, which is very important. And here, Charles Correa's Gandhi Ashram, Doshi's School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, and this late Hall of Nations by Raj Riwal, which unfortunately was demolished. But while India's independence, although closing the debate on architecture and identity, did not provide or make the society for which the nation had hoped and yearned. Instead, all efforts were directed towards dealing with a splintered society that the nation had inherited. And this is a collage by David Wild, where he's taken Manorama Ben's house by Corbusier in Ahmedabad and overlaid his readings. Actually, what this really talks about also is how the patrons, the Sarabhais, had all these worlds and lives nestled into even this piece of modern architecture, because it was all embraced equally in their lives. But it also is emblematic for me as a reading of the kind of splintered, pluralistic, diverse society India was, which was in the process of being reconciled. And so it became overly evident during these years that really aesthetic modernity seemed to have arrived in India before the social modernization project. And this happened through a small community of architects who had become hosts to these new ideas. And so architects began to struggle to make their modernism work. And I think this is the brilliance of the first generation of post-independent architects, is they managed to place their modernity in a cultural context, which was much more complex. And so what you have is a complete morphing of stylistic clarity as the nation state continues to mature, become more confident to embrace its own diversity in the visual representation of this diversity, challenging our ability really to develop any clear narrative for the conservation of this heritage. And this is what we are struggling with when we talk about conserving modern architecture, when we talk about conserving more contemporary works, because what are the narratives by which we kind of speculate about this? And so the constructing of these conservation narrative is critical. I'm not sure, I don't have the answer, but I just want to put on the table for our discussion 4 points, which I think at least I've been thinking about, which I think could be useful as we carry on these conversations. So these were the 4 points that came to me, which is reverence with age and time, the question of discerning significance, then the question, are we perpetuating a heritage pandemic because, sometimes this sort of goes out on its own and on a limb. And then the question is, who is the client? And I think these questions become really very critical. So let's look at reverence with age and time. Because if we don't have a vision for conservation, we are kind of restricted in operating in what I call the postcard city. It's really landscapes of nostalgia, and our theories are constructed around the assumption that our city is static, our cultures are static, our identity is static, not something that is perpetually constructed, which is really the truth, because these things really move. So in this approach, then architecture becomes naturally the only mechanism by which memory is codified. And so the question really becomes, how do we imagine these futures while retaining the past? And how do we work with the kind of discontinuities, inconsistencies, even in aspirations that we can't reconcile? And I think this becomes a very important question, and a very complex one, actually. And this gets complicated by the fact, and these are pages from Rem Koolhaas's famous book called Contents, by the fact that, when the first act in 1882 was established, they were talking about saving things from 200 BC. By the 1990 revision, we were looking at 1700s and the heritage from there. By the 1960s revisions, we are looking at 20th century architecture. So the question is, this time gap between the object we want to conserve and the moment of the conservation is actually collapsing very quickly. And so what does this really mean? Somebody said to me the other day, Kaiwan Mehta, a friend, who was telling me about how, senior architect said, I find it hard to look at modern buildings, but if I look at colonial buildings, I can look at them with reverence because, they're what they are. I find it hard to look at modern buildings. And I found that a very disturbing comment, because actually, when I look at my colonial buildings, I read it through a political lens and I see terrible stories behind them. I can't hold them in reverence. I hold the IIM by Louis Kahn or the buildings by Corbusier in much greater reverence than I look at those, because they were part of the construction of our national identity, not colonial suppression. So then does it become an aesthetic thing? So if you look at the Rajabai Tower and our tears swell, our eyes swell with tears, then look at Akshardham, which was built 10 years ago. These are our modern buildings. So of course we look at these in reverence, but I think we look at these in reverence because of the embedded stories in their aesthetic sort of messages and what that might trigger off. So we have to be careful about, this is also nostalgia when we say that, right? And now this is amazing, this building Akshardham, which was built 10 years ago, it could have been built 5,000 years ago and it would have been consistent. So how we look at reverence with age and time is a complicated question, and we have to develop a narrative around it. Let's look at discerning significance. And we look at significance, which we've been told through different charters, and we have checklists of things about authenticity, about many aspects. But like in a post-colonial condition, when the creators of an environment are different from the custodian of that environment, which is all of us, of course, the narratives have to be different. We can't discern significance and get nostalgic about the fact that Edward came around riding his black horse, or Queen Victoria walked through an arcade. That doesn't mean anything for us. Yes, the buildings might be robust, but they have to be different narratives which tell us why they're significant, and how we construct those narratives becomes very important. Now, for the conservationists, for institutions like the World Monuments Fund, it becomes more complex, because you're trying to create the illusion or retain the illusion or conserve the illusion and the architectural integrity of an environment, but you have to create other narratives which get people to connect to these places differently. That is like really walking the tightrope, and therefore highly complex. Or when Chandigarh is taken over by World Yoga Day and even new structures are built, it's a wonderful moment. It, I think, adds a layer of significance to the way the public space, albeit temporarily, because everything is a temporal kind of installation and can be reversed. So it doesn't actually, it allows the kind of static city and the kind of kinetic moment of temporality to lay over new significances even temporarily. And even us allowing this temporal occupancy occupation of space in different ways without compromising the integrity of the architecture becomes critical. Because I think in our societies, constructing this cultural significance is critical. Otherwise, we'll be destined to live in the postcard city. And of course, coming up from the best way to think about it is adaptive reuse, upcycling uses, etc. Because that way you can drain the ideological kind of symbolism of some of these buildings and imbue new uses while saving its architectural integrity. So the heritage pandemic, this is important because, you know, it's sort of accused of being elitist, it's accused of sort of many other things. And it has become a pandemic because, in my view, what has happened is the whole debate about conservation and preservation has detached itself from the process of planning, and it's become a silo in itself. And that's why I choose to call it a heritage pandemic, because then with that comes a memory inflation and a lack of inclusion of a kind of broader debate. And the reason that global conservation practices have moved further, and this is the reason why they've moved away from planning. They've become an insulated thing in themselves. And the challenge in India in the coming decades is to really balance development and conservation, a critical equilibrium for the health of both our physical ecology and the delicate social ecology. And that's why to resituate the debate in planning processes is incredibly critical. And again, the choice of having such a public space, which is also a piece of social, sports, cultural infrastructure, and as well as public space, is very critical. So in the current culture of building and architecture, far too much, I'm talking about architecture broadly, too much premium is paid on innovation over repair and maintenance. And I'm bringing back very prosaic categories of repair and maintenance, because repair and maintenance is the nitty-gritty of it. And our sensitivity will come with how we do that as an ongoing process. I mean, look at the debate even around the IIM, look at the debate around most modern conservation buildings. They have completely neglected maintenance in the way they should have been. And actually, architects who put out objects in the world should be responsible for that. You know, in Chinese medicine, they used to say that the Chinese doctor, in traditional Chinese medicine, the Chinese doctor is paid as on a retainer while you're well. The moment you fall sick, they stop paying you the retainer till you get well again, right? So that completely reverses the relationship. And I think architects should have that relationship with buildings, especially if they're charged with its conservation. And so I think coming back to basic ideas of repair, maintenance as part of this conversation becomes really critical in ways we imagine these. And the last is, who is the client? And I finish in 2 minutes. I'm sorry if I might be a little over. But who is the client becomes a critical question in constructing these narratives. You know, when we do new buildings, we also look at it very simplistically. We say it's a client. No, actually, the client is many entities. In a single family house, the client becomes one entity, and you might have to negotiate the frictions between a couple and their differences. But beyond that, it's one client, right? But otherwise, clients are a patron client, an operational client, and a user client. These get differentiated. In government projects, often the patron client, the chief minister, has nothing to do with the users or hardly any connection except looking for their vote. And the operational client might be the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, might be the Public Works Department. They often also are disconnected. The architect becomes this big connector between them. And the broader this constituency, weaving the aspirations of all disparate parts of that constituency becomes a critical part of constructing these narratives. And then, of course, there's a scalar question of what is national, what is state, what is community, what is private. What becomes private, the constituency, by its own nature, collapses into a much more refrained or much more contained entity. So let's take the example of the stadium. The stadium, the constituency is, if nothing else, at least the whole city. Of course, among architects, it might be a national constituency. With the WMF putting it on the watch list, it becomes partly a global constituency. A project like the Mill Owners Association becomes very private. It is an association. Of course, it embraces the public. In the question of the IIM in Ahmedabad by Louis Kahn, it's the alum, which is the biggest constituency, and then the group of global architects local architects, historians. How do we expand these constituencies becomes a critical question. And this has been the march of preservation, which has gone from monuments to building sets back to districts to cultural landscapes. It is all about how one expands this into the world's heritage, right? And so I think in all of this, really context matters. And I have been struck very much, and this has lived in my mind since 2006 when I was working with Amita, Baig and Annabelle and many others on a project for the Taj Mahal. And we were struck by a little reporting that came in the Times of India in 2006, which used a wonderful category called incomparable heritage. We were talking about world heritage, and heritage was already a misused word. And that's why I used the word the pandemic. I even had a developer when I was on the heritage committee, when we rejected his high-rise building, he said he'll come back in a week and he'll put heritage into the building, which meant he would change the facade to arches. So heritage has become a category that has been kind of misused and distorted, but incomparable heritage. And they talked about the tiger, the Taj Mahal, and the Valley of Flowers. Now, what is important about all of these is they sit in an ecology. The tiger can't survive without the ecology in which it lives. The Valley of the Flowers is an incredible ecology, and so is the Taj Mahal. We forget that. And this is a project we did as an academic project with support from the World Monument Fund at Harvard University, where we said, if we have to understand the future of the Taj, we have to understand the future of Agra. We have to understand the future of the river landscape on which the Taj is one of 40 monuments, which were pleasure gardens. And we've forgotten all of this. And if you don't reclaim that landscape, actually the Taj becomes almost meaningless. So context does matter. It would change completely the understanding of the Taj Mahal and its preservation, and all the things we're coming up in preserving monuments like the Taj would change if we understood its context. And therefore, conservation is an instrument of planning, and we shouldn't forget that. And actually, projective preservation actually will be planning. And that's really what the future of it is. So to conclude, I'll say, to work within this highly complex entity of urban India, to look at our modern heritage, I think notions of cultural significance need to be broadened to respond to a highly pluralistic society where cultural memory is often an enacted process. It's played out. I mean, a cricket match is an enacted process. Its associations are powerful. In conservation debates within the dynamic context, it's perhaps necessary to focus even more intensely on the notion of constructing significance. In fact, understanding how significance evolves will truly clarify the role of the conservation and the profession of conservation, from being thought of as one who opposes change to one who manages and facilitates change. In the case of the latter, a conservator would be seen as an agent not only of retaining what survives from the past, but giving expression to contemporary aspirations which are intangible without compromising the integrity of the building. So just to go back to Ahmedabad, I think the context of the city is ripe to build this constituency. I think buildings like the IIM, which are under debate right now, are critical. This is an image I took only 16 months ago. These buildings are robust. They tell incredible stories. I think the challenge will be how new aspirations are met within these buildings without compromising the integrity of these sort of structures, this architecture, but also how a constituency can be widened where this also becomes an asset that the whole city actually stands up for, more than just the alum of Ahmedabad and a bunch of us architects and historians who think it's important. It's the same thing for Corbusier's buildings. Charles Correa Gandhi Ashram, in a perverse stroke by whoever did this, they painted the exposed concrete. Really a lazy solution. One has to safeguard from this even more and more. But finally, context matters. Building a constituency for the stadium will be important. It has great potential. What Shivaji Park did as a crucible for cultivating talent that went finally to Brabant Stadium, this stadium should do for the youth of Ahmedabad, even if we just took cricket as one narrative among many other narratives of public space that we can think of. And the robustness of the structure allows that to happen. It can embrace its context, it can open up new uses, it can extend its usefulness. And so I think finally, conservation has to be anticipatory. It has to fold back into planning. And it has to be ahead of planning and not something that we jump about in retrograde. And I think this is, I think, the future of the stadium, how it sits in the city. It's a very beautiful object in the city, and the city has grown around it. This has become even more valuable as an asset, not only as a piece of beautiful technology and beautiful architecture, but also as a piece of cultural, social, and sports infrastructure, which will make it a very rare entity going forward. So thank you very much for the time to share these thoughts.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. And I think we're going to have a slew of questions to hear. And so I'm going to introduce my colleague, Javier Ausín, to moderate the discussion. And before he starts again, Rahul, thank you so much. And we look forward to your joining us for the discussions.
Thank you, Amita, and thank you, Rahul. At this point, as we start the Q&A section, I would like to bring Rahul back to the screen. And I would like to also introduce Mr. Nitin Sangwan. He is the Deputy Municipal Commissioner and CEO of Smart City. He is an IIT Madras alumnus with a master's in business administration and has worked in the private sector before joining the public service. As Deputy Municipal Commissioner, he focuses on both urbanization as well as e-governance and campaigns to raise awareness among students about the importance of sustainable development. Welcome, Mr. Sangwan. I know that we have a lot of interesting questions from the audience. The chat has been very active. There is actually a very interesting debate about, more historic buildings and modern architecture. So I would like to start off the conversation by bringing this question about modern architecture, which tends to face a lack of global appreciation. This is in part because of its architecture that is relatively recent, and also because its significance and cultural meaning is sometimes not understood, although we got a really great critical perspective today through your presentation, Rahul. So what do you think architects and heritage professionals, scholars, planners could do to foster a higher appreciation around these sites and to communicate their importance better?
For me? Yes.
Yes, Rahul, please.
Okay, thank you. No. I mean, of course, that's a complicated question. And I think I alluded to it in terms of broadening constituency. So let me just take the example of modern architecture in India, right? I think how we craft and articulate its significance becomes very important. So let me just even go back. I mean, I mentioned Doshi and Charles Correa naturally because this is his project. But there were so many others, Kuldeep Singh, there's Raj Rewal, Kanvinde built in Ahmedabad, their number. Now, if you go back to the moment of the first 2 decades, as I was trying to outline, there was a very particular project. What the Nehruvian project through Chandigarh was about creating a pan-Indian identity. We were situating a new nation state, right? And the pan-Indian identity really dissolved, I believe, in terms of the instrumentality of architecture after the emergency in the 70s, and the exhibition that I did with Ranjit Hoskote and Kaiwan Mehta on the state of architecture actually defined those moments very clearly. Now, when that project breaks and you have a kind of regionalism and you have, the construction of very localized identities, actually people get drawn further away, even as broader constituencies from it. And that's why I think constructing new significances in which ways these buildings in their localities play an important role without undermining, in fact, while celebrating all the technological and architectural beauty or achievements that these buildings also display and are emblematic of becomes very critical. And so I think that is really the challenge. And the challenge is how, I think the challenge is that critical one of creating the integrity of the architecture intact, but finding other ways that people relate to these buildings, whether it's in the way they're used, in the way what they mean, etc. And that's why planning is important, because suddenly if you had a ring of very high-rise buildings around the stadium, the context changes completely, the value of this land goes up completely. And therefore, unless we in our planning processes understand and build in the importance of this heritage, we'll always be a losing battle.
Thank you, Rahul. Well, you're mentioning, planning. You mentioned in your presentation the importance of the stadium in Ahmedabad for the people of Ahmedabad, and I think there is a question along those lines that says that architects, planners, heritage professionals are talking a lot about questions of social inclusion. What do you think is the role that sites like Patel Stadium could play to foster more inclusivity with the communities around them and to engage those communities in kind of the process or the management process, the conservation process moving forward?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so therefore you can look at this at many, many levels, right? One can look at this as public space, right? One can actually organize it. I mean, look at Ahmedabad actually is a leader in this. What I see happening at Law Garden, where on a temporal scale markets are set up and managed by the municipality I mean, we look at that as an example internationally as bringing temporality and imagining time within planning processes, right? This is such a robust piece of infrastructure. Cricket can be one aspect of it because cricket needs a certain kind of formalization, right? You can't have people running around, although in the Oval Maidan and Shivaji Park, you have 25 cricket games going on at the same time, but that's another matter. But there's so many margins for space here that this could be used for cultural events. It could be used just as a recreation area in some parts of the day where the elderly could come and sit and walk around. It could be really treated as a public space through the management of access, through the management of facilities. And that's why I pointed out the structure is so robust that you can accommodate a whole slew of activities within it without compromising its integrity. And that's what I mean by extending the margins of its usefulness. So this is a project that, I mean, can easily be thought through, but it requires two or three things. One, it requires putting up on the top of our priorities the notion of publicness, and then using intelligently temporality as temporal scales and managing temporal scales to allow different things to happen simultaneously. And that was what was wonderful. And that's why I like that image of World Yoga Day, where the whole plaza has people stretching in all sorts of directions with all sorts of temporary structures that don't compromise the integrity of the space and are reversible. So you consider this as an armature, as a very robust armature around which many things can happen, unhappen, disappear, appear, all touching the land and the building very lightly.
Thank you. Well, and I would like to add that I think that kind of community component will be a very important one for the development of the conservation management plan that it's undergoing.
Absolutely.
You've actually did a great, an excellent job contextualizing the stadium as a larger constellation of sites in Ahmedabad and in India. And there is a question here about what your opinion on what do you think we could learn from this modern post-independence architecture in India, and specifically from the generation of Indian architects that were part of that period and contributed so much to Indian architecture and heritage?
Look, I mean, that could be a lecture in itself. It's a challenge and I've done many lectures, you'll find even on YouTube for whoever's asked that question, and done a book which explains that in some detail. But I mean, I think there are many things that are important about the first generation of Indian architects. I mean, I think, like I said, I think they struggle to place that modernity in a very specific cultural context, right? And then there are many things you can open out from that. They opened out new ways of spatial imagination. They opened out new ways of extending through their own ability to abstract. And that abstraction came from their training in modernism to take traditional practices, whether they're spatial practices, cultural practices, and find new formulations of space for them. I mean, that's what's brilliant about the Gandhi Ashram, for example, where Charles Correa takes the open to sky spaces as a way of organizing not only a sense of ambiguity, but a range and a spectrum of spatial possibilities in which space can be occupied. He removes glass completely from the equation and creates an ambiguity between inside and outside. All that you could extract that all from traditional spatial practices in our country and our culture, but it begins to get translated into an idiom, which gives us the bridge to the moment. If we didn't have that bridge, we couldn't. You could also take technology, what Mahendra Raj does by translating handmade concrete at scales like this with complexities like this. I mean, there's such beautiful details there in the video. I don't know if you noticed, but even the staircase comes down and becomes a beam on the first tread and it floats above the floor. So you see the staircase feels like it's suspended, the railing folds and becomes something else. And so there's a kind of poetry in the technology. And what Mahendra Raj did in collaboration with the many architects he worked with showed us ways that we could embrace this new modernity of even technology, which already Corbusier had bought in. Art Deco architecture had introduced it, but not with the kind of with the poetic flourish that this stadium does and many of the Corbusian buildings do. And so there are many levels at which one can extract learnings, but clearly it was a very important period because again, to use Charles Correa's word, it wasn't just a transfer, but it was a transformation. It was a transformation that made it appropriate for the context in the way modernity found its roots within the Indian context. In many societies, I think all of the Middle East, it was just a transfer, right? There wasn't a remaking of that modernity to embrace the locality. And I think that is very critical.
Thank you, Rahul. There are a lot of interesting questions, but before we wrap up, I really want to invite Mr. Sangwan to share with us some remarks and also tell us about the role of the municipality in this interesting process.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I must thank Mr. Mehrotra for giving such a deep insight. I think his umbilical cord with Ahmedabad is still very intact. And, in fact, I gained a lot today. I mean, with his deep knowledge and with deep explanation of things. And as he rightly mentioned, that if we want to conserve, these kind of monuments, then our definition of client has to expand. So that is I believe the core, that we should be taking home today. And I could also read the various questions. So the first thing that we need to get out is from our obsession with what is heritage and what is cultural heritage. So cultural heritage is not merely what is ancient or what was related to a particular period of or particular era of humanity or a particular country. So it should be having a very broad definition. And what was one of the question, what should be the role of architects? I think it's the role of not only the architects, it's the role of the administrators also. It's the role of media also and the political authorities also, that we should be sensitizing people about what is worth conserving and what we should be taking pride in. It's both modern also, and it's ancient also, and it's medieval also, and that's how we can preserve cultural heritage. And as being in Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, we also value that, and we also cannot put less emphasis upon one thing and put very high emphasis on other thing. And that's how we can promote social inclusivity also. And I think that's a very recurring theme in the various questions that I was going through, how we promote social inclusiveness in such kind of architectural buildings, or when we conserve them and when the value is added to them and to the vicinity and the neighboring areas, how that value addition is distributed equitably in the society. So I must appreciate the thought of line of thought of Professor Mehrotra. Yeah, so in Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, I must also add to what Professor Mehrotra added regarding inclusivity. The stadium is open to everyone, right from morning walkers to to various cultural events, and even the 50th Golden Jubilee celebration of Gujarat government took place here. So which was a celebration of democracy. So it's not like this stadium is reserved for one particular event or one particular sporting category. This stadium is a part of larger cultural heritage, about which not only Ahmedabad but every Indian, and I think as these institutions are a part of some global heritage. what is modern now will become, medieval at some point of time and ancient at some other point of time. So I think we should detach ourselves and we should have slightly less disdain for the current and modern architecture, and we should not, ignoring them. I think today's this webinar should underline this point also. What is, what we are using today, and as Professor rightly pointed out, some structure will be ephemeral and some structure will be made, for lasting long. So it's we who have to decide and who have to appreciate the significance of the both, apart from which are old and which we have already preserved. So we should be thinking in that direction right now. In Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, I particularly handle this stadium for day-to-day operations. And I must thank World Monument Fund, Professor Mehrotra and Amita Baig for bringing more than 200 participants, which I can see on the screen right now on this amazing platform. And I believe they must have gained equally as I have gained today from this conversation. And as Professor Mehrotra rightly pointed out, that the client base, each one of us who has joined on this platform today is actually that client base. So let us do our bit in whatever way we can do. And I believe we will be able to not only preserve, but also promote such kind of cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sangwan, and we so look forward to partnership with you and an evolving dialogue, and I hope with Mr. Professor Mehrotra as well, so that we can really give back to the city a meaningful space, which, as you say, is with everybody. It is an inclusive space, and I think that was one of the reasons why we listed it, is because so many people use it. In closing, I'd like to thank the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects, our partners for this event. I'd also like to remind everybody that the nominations for the 2022 World Monuments Watch are open. We've extended the date to May 1st, so please nominate a site, become a part of this movement to spread the word and expand our definition of the heritage, as Rahul very rightly pointed out today. I hope you will join us for the next On My Watch event. I think that's scheduled on April 22nd. It's a webinar on the work of local communities from Derbyshire and Nottingham to revive the Benelli Viaduct, a 19th century railroad. So, that the community is hugely involved in that, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. And then it is my particular privilege and honor to introduce Professor Mahendra Raj, renowned structural engineer, and I too have had the privilege of working with him. He is one of India's most distinguished engineers with an illustrious career spanning over almost 70 years. Working alongside the finest architects in India, to Professor Mahendra Raj goes the last word.
I'm very happy that Getty Foundation has taken this structure to maintain it. It is worth maintaining. It is something which tells us the technical know-how in technology which was available in India and used in the 60s, which was put to use to come up with bold structures. I hope it is maintained properly, it is studied properly. If any help is required from me, so long as I'm alive, it will be available. Thank you.